Sinn Féiners raid and have cut the telegraph posts and pulled up the line between here and Dublin. Went down to the farm, and there Mr. Phillips told me they have seized the mansion house and post office and castle, and bloodshed going on. I should like 24 hours in command in Dublin.
That was a diary entry from Lady Longford, with her reaction to hearing about the rising on the Tuesday after Easter in 1916. It reflected a common feeling of annoyance at the rising at the time, but that would change with the cruelty of the executions.
Right, the war ended in 1918 in Europe, but it didn't end in Ireland. It went on to 1919 with the War of Independence and then the Civil War. So it went on for another 6 years, until 1923.
Attacks on the army and RIC around the country would rise as the aspiring nation moved towards independence. Torr House near Tyrrell's Pass was one house that was on the receiving end of early agitation in Westmeath. Torr at that stage was newly leased by the McKennas from the original and well thought of Pilkington family. The McKennas were subjected to a lot of local agitation in the form of cattle driving. This is where the cattle were driven off the fields onto the roads and maybe even further, and left on their own until rounded up again. It was a tradition of agitation going back many years and would be carried on well into the 1920s in Westmeath.
I have now in my file somewhere, I've a list of where the local men here was going round and they were cutting Pilkingtons or McKenna's fences and hunting his cattle up the road and everything. They got 12 months. They got 12 months in Mountjoy for it, like, you know. But this has been going on for a few years.
My father was born in 1913, so he was 8, I suppose, in 21, and he remembered well the Tans coming and taking him out of bed and looking for his brother Sean, you know, my uncle, and he had a hideout in the railway line, dug into the bank, and he used to sleep there at night while he was on the run from the Tans at the time.
It's been extraordinarily difficult for big house owners because they were, I mean, I think most of them were horrified by the activities of the Black and Tans, and again it produced frightful hardship, kind of relations between them and people they'd always got on with till then.
I used to hear my father saying anyway, there was a coachman, like horse and coach. And the station is up that way, it's about 2 miles up that way. And the captain was coming home from England or wherever he was. And the coachman was out to meet him anyway. And he went up and he met him, and it was a lovely evening. How are you, Captain? And he said, I'm grand. This. You know what I was just thinking? He says, I think I'll walk down instead. And halfway down the road somewhere, 2 fellas came out from behind a tree, had guns with them, stuck their head in. Where is he? Who? Captain. Oh, what? I'm after leaving him at the train. But the train is only after coming in. No, that's the other train. That was the only thing that he told us. So obviously he was a marked man, and there was someone to squeal to let him.
and they, with great uncle William, they landed up and threatening him, and he said, it's all right, lads, boys, I'm an old man, go ahead, shoot me. So there's no point in shooting somebody who doesn't offer any sort of resistance.
I had an uncle then, Uncle John Kelly, who was brother of Bernie Kelly's, the Republican. And the British Army, the Black and Tans, came to the house one day looking for Bernie. And John was there, and they knew Bernie was over in Quinns. And when the Tans left, he went across the field and into Quinns to tell them that they were on their way, you see. So Bernie got under the feather mattress, and Mrs. Quinn got in on top of him. And the British Army came, and John was there, and he was after simmering Tullybaan and the rest of him.
One of the most remembered incidents in Westmeath was the attack on Moydrum Castle, the home of Lord Castlemaine, a prominent English peer in 1921. Locals all have differing relatives' memories of that event.
The boys that did cause the fire, they used to train in our field up in Blairy every other night. Some of them were from Coast. So they passed down by the gable end of our house on that night to commit, because 5 or 6 of their houses in Coast was burnt down the night before by the Black and Tans from England, and they were very, very cruel, you know.
And in retaliation they came round and burnt a lot of houses. And so then in retaliation again, the volunteers burnt the castle. So I think it started more or less, that was the start when we said that incident in Coulson.
There was 30 soldiers marched on the castle the night it was burned. And the man in command was a man by the name of Thomas Costello from Athlone. But then my uncle was one of the ordinary volunteers, Sean Costello. So they thought that there'd be resistance there. They were all armed, 30 of them, and they put up no fight. Lord Castlemaine himself was in England at the time, and they brought the lady herself out, and she sat on a rock in the courtyard, and they burned down the castle.
It was 7 men that burnt Moydrum Castle. They have stories on the paper there that there was 50 men. There was no 50 men, there was 7 men. No one knew who they were. The leader of the gang told me. How I come to know was, I brought him to a funeral, and he went over and sympathised with a brother of the man that was dead, and he says to him, he was one of the 7. And that man's brother asked me after, he says, your uncle, he says, sympathised with me, and he says that my brother was one of the 7. What did he mean by that? So I asked my uncle, and he told me.
Well, I don't think the people around here would have anything wrong to say about Lord Castlemaine. I suppose the fact they picked that house because it was British, you know. But I never heard anything wrong said about Castlemaine, and he was a good employer, I'm sure he was, and I'm sure lots of people worked in it. But it's collateral damage, I suppose, you know.
Lord Castlemaine was burned out because they wanted his land, pure and simple. Even though all he had left was his domain, inside the domain wall, the rest was all sold off. But that wasn't enough for the local revolutionaries down there. They wanted the rest of the land, and they burnt it out.
All these mansions at the time were under threat because it was the policy of the IRA at the time to get these people out and get the land divided. That's what they were after.
And they burnt another big house the following night as well, so it was part of a campaign to get them out. And they came back subsequently and burned out estate houses to get rid of the records, of course, and other houses, other parts of the estate buildings were burnt as well. So that's what that was about.
Well, after a couple of days you could go down to it, it was completely burnt out, like, you know, so that was I think that was in 1920 or 21, wasn't it, yeah. So that land was all, the government, when the government was formed here, they took over all the land and they divided it up
I mean, there's only Howard Bury, who was out on the Everest reconnaissance when the War of Independence was going on, and he was, constantly afraid that, he was going to get a letter from home telling him that Belvedere had been burnt, but it wasn't. I think there was, at Charleville Castle, there was some outbuilding was burnt, but not the castle itself, because again, the Earls of Bury seem to have been regarded as pretty good landlords in that.
It was a very turbulent time. I don't think people realise generally how vicious and how turbulent the War of Independence and the Civil War were, how bitter and so these felt under threat. You had 9 houses burnt in Westmeath during that period. And 9, between the Civil War, War of Independence and the Civil War. You had 9 big houses burnt in Westmeath.
That there had been this kind of tradition, particularly among some of the very senior staff who tended to be Scottish, and they all left. So it did bring about changes, but it did become more difficult for them, and so you see the beginnings then of the end.
Several country houses in Westmeath were burned down during the weekend. In all cases, the houses were occupied by Protestants. Torr House, a splendid mansion in the Elizabethan style of architecture, the property of Colonel Pilkington, was among those destroyed, and there alone the damage is estimated at over £40,000.
I got the story from Bill McKenna's grandson. 1921, Christy Martin, he led the crew that got them to go in. Oh, they were going to shoot the whole lot of them. 50 men went in there. And what happened was, they went in and there was Bill McKenna and he'd 2 or 3 brothers. The lads came in, all armed up, and they got all the maids and the women that was in the house, and they put salted Hessian sacks round them and made them sit all under the trees. And they're going to shoot them all. But apparently one of the maids recognised Christy Martin's voice, and him being the commander, and she told him, she said, "I know who you are." She says, "Christy," like that. So then they thought, no, instead of murdering them all, shooting them all, we'll burn the house down. Before they set fire to it, the battle started, and the 3 McKenna sons were up in the top floor, and the IRA boys assembled at the garden wall, and they were shouting up to each other, and the IRA was saying, "There's no way out. This is it, the end of the road for you. We're driving you off this land, and that's all that's to it." And they did, because the sons got away in a motor car.
Mr. Henry J. McKenna deposed that he had been subject to a persistent boycott. Armed men came to his house and gave inmates 20 minutes to get out. They had to leave, and when they returned, the place was in ruins.
But the fallout after the burning went on for years, because and you've got to, even now I was told to be very careful what I say, because there's conflicting stories.
After independence, quite a number of the families do seem to have felt that this wasn't the place for them anymore. It wasn't. You did have the burning of a number of big houses around, and I think that kind of sent a message, that we're not really welcome here.
After the fears and terrors of the War of Independence, for Westmeath, a moment of triumph, as the British forces left the barracks in the town and were replaced by the approaching new Irish Army and their leader, General McKeown. But this sense of celebration would be short-lived, as the country then plunged into a divisive civil war.
It all went back down to partition, what we're talking about now, you know. Like, partition never worked and still doesn't work. But I suppose on the other hand, the people who signed the treaty, they had to sign it because they were going to start killing us if they didn't. So they had Hopkins' choice, I suppose, you know. But yeah, I suppose if you go back and look at Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael families, that was the divide. Like they were both born out of civil war politics. This was probably, my father's family probably was a Republican family, you know. His brother Brian was married to Dorothy Hughes, whose brother was Tommy Hughes, who was executed in the barracks in Athlone by the Free State. So that was civil war politics, which was an ugly politics, you know.
Mr. Stewart told me he has written to your ladyship when he heard about the raid. I am sorry it has happened and that the bicycles were taken. Also the electric torches and 2 hats from Lady Pansy's room, the whisky and claret from the cellar. I don't know what they have taken from your ladyship's sitting room. They seem to have spent a lot of time there, also in the housemaid's living room, where they had a good meal of cake, milk and new eggs. They stole from that room a very nice pair of scissors and a case belonging to Pakenham Hall. What I feel most is the shock at finding the 3 weird figures with lighted candles and revolvers standing in the passage.
Pakenham's, their house wasn't touched because Lord Longford was killed in the First World War in Gallipoli. And he had got on very well. Again, relationships with the local tenantry and the local people was a big factor there as well.
It is strange that in the middle of a civil war for the rights of a free Irish nation, that the big house owners who were under threat because of the perception of them as British saw themselves to be nothing but Irish.
I've had in Ethiopian places, of course, people have said to me, "You're not Irish. I see you've got an Irish passport, but you're not Irish, are you?" And I say, "What do you mean?" "Well, listen to your voice. You're English. You've got an English voice." And they see just a simple relationship between accent and nationality and identity. I would reject that. My father was quite kind of simple-minded in a way, and just said, "Proud to be Irish," just like that.
I knew the O'Muracle, who was, a descendant of the kings of Leinster, but had been educated in England and served in the British Army. So yeah, it's kind of that whole thing of Irish blood and English heart.
A lot of Catholic families, like the Nugents, say on Ballinlough. I was speaking to Nick Nugent out there, and he says, "People think we're Blowens." He says, "We're here longer than any of them." He says, "We're here since that land is in their family since Norman times, since the 1100s, when they came over with the Anglo-Normans, the Nugents, and they still have that land to this day." He says, "And people think we're Blowens."
Colonel Howard Bury was a unionist until, the Irish Free State came into being. I'm not sure how he would have seen himself. I suspect he probably saw himself as British, but he lived in Ireland half a century. It was his home.
Towards the end of all the conflicts, foreign and domestic, and after massive tax rises to upwards of 70%, and major changes in society around them that meant that the role of the domestic worker was seen very differently, the days of the big house owner in Westmeath were largely coming to an end.
People saw that there was maybe more, with the
advent of, building and things getting better, that they saw that there was more money to be made. So then those people, they either went away to work, and so then the generations wore out. So the big houses had nobody to work, and they couldn't afford to pay them the big wage now that they were now commanding out, where outside, say, of the big house and estate environment.
There was a letter that my grandmother wrote to her sister in Canada to state how hard times were since the gentry went. That was after the burning of Moydrum and Castle, which was 100 years ago there in August. And that she described my father, of how he was willing to work, but the farmers had no money to pay him. There was no money since the gentry left.
Get these rather poignant accounts of great big freezing houses where the lord and lady are sort of huddled in front of the fire, and the drafts going, they can't afford to do anything, there's holes in the roof, and there's so the number of staff that would have been dropping off.
I am the first of my family for 400 years who didn't work in the big house, and the opportunity was there for me when I was 13, because the lady from the manor called in on her way home from Mullingar one day and said, "Now Lizzie, I have a few hours in the house for Olive on a Saturday if you want to send her up." And my mother said, "Thank you very much," she said, "but my daughter will never work in service." And she said, "Oh really, are we that bad?" And Mammy said, "No," she said, "it's just there's more opportunities for her than there were for me."
I don't actually remember ever being told, "Now you mustn't do that," but the whole atmosphere around wasn't conducive for us to go into service.
As many of our interviewees looked back on the memories of their parents or their own experiences, despite what we might imagine would be their reaction of having served as servants in the big houses, surprisingly many had only good things to say.
We tend to have a look back and we sort of shudder at the word servant and think, oh, that was a terrible thing. But they were servants, they weren't slaves, they were servants. They were paid, they did have a day off or a couple of days off. And it was actually, for many of them, it was a very good job. Particularly, some of them were able to, go home at night, and particularly the younger ones. And if it could be a job for life. And it was a different type of society. It was perhaps a more deferential society than we are now.
Reading the wills of some of the landowners, particularly one of them being Francis Chapman. He was the owner of South Hill House. He would have been an uncle of Lawrence of Arabia. When he died, he was a single man. When he died in 1915, he left a substantial sum of money to his butler.
Colonel was a gentleman, lovely, big man and big smile on him. And they used to have parties for all the workers' families twice a year, once down at Lough Ennel, and you'd be brought down in a tractor and trailer and creels, and it could be 30 youngsters in the place. And Mrs. Bide now, she was young, but she appeared to be a character. Like, she used to be out playing sports with us, like.
But I did like and I did enjoy Daramona. It was a wonderful place. To say that you had been inside the walls and worked in there was a great thing then. But to look at the house from the outside, it was a pity that anybody wrecked it the way they did. They took down wing after wing, and in olden days it must have been a beautiful place and gave lots of employment.
The day my mother died, my mother was sick for a long time, she had cancer. And Mrs. Purden was coming home from the show and she stopped in Moneygar for something, or in Killucan for something. And someone said to her, it's sad about Lizzie, you know, she died this morning. Well, she came in and she was hysterical and she's sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And I was saying to her, you know, it's okay, like, she didn't suffer. And you're saying all the right things. And she said, oh no, Olive, you'll never understand what she meant to me. She said, I went into that house, she said, as a young woman. She said, having to uphold a lot of standards and rituals and things I didn't understand. And she said, I'd go down in the morning and your mother would say to me, I'd say, there's 10 coming for lunch on Sunday, Lizzie. We'll have such a thing. And Mammy would say to her, well now, Miss Purden, you see, it's tradition it's such and such a time of the year and such a thing, we'll have rabbit stew or we'll have pheasant or whatever. And she said she never let me make a mistake.
We cannot look back on all these memories of the past and judge them by our standards today. Those days were very different, and people had to work to support their families as they could. I would have everyone remember L.P. Hartley's famous opening line of his novel that perfectly sums up this series of videos and memories. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there.